Well, good evening. We are glad to have our Mansfield friends with us tonight. Appreciate their presence. I will explain to them what we're going to do. On Sunday night, we have basically a Bible study where I preach. Okay? Uh, what we are doing during these months is we are taking New Testament principles and we are turning to the Old Testament to see examples, because the Old Testament, we're told, is a schoolmaster for us. In other words, the things that happened to the Jews in the Old Testament are lessons that we as Christians need to learn. And we've talked about a number of them. I'm going to ask you as we begin tonight to turn in the New Testament to the letter of Paul to the churches of Galatia, Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6. We're going to look here in verse 7 because it is our theme tonight. It is a verse that all of you know by heart, I suspect. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap." In other words, we reap what we sow. And there are several principles associated with that. And we'll be looking at them tonight. I want to go back to the Old Testament now, and we're not going to read anything because we're going to cover so much territory that we would be here for a long period of time tonight. But we want to look at one Old Testament person. We want to look at Jacob. Now, I want to start with Jacob's birth. And then we're going to go almost to, we'll go to his death. But our subject tonight is entitled, Jacob Reaps a Harvest. Jacob reaps what he sows. You know that Jacob's father and mother were who, folks? Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah, of course, was not a wife that Isaac chose. Somebody else chose his wife. By the way, is that a good idea that we need to incorporate? I don't know a teenage boy in America that thinks that's a good idea. You don't want his mom and daddy picking one for him. But anyway, Isaac loved Rebekah. They are a very interesting couple. It's quite interesting that many of the things that Isaac and Rebekah did were very much inappropriate, very appropriate for even Christians. But Rebekah expected children, and she knew that she was going to have twins, and the twins were who? You got it backwards, Nathan. Esau and Rebekah. No, that's not right either. Esau and Jacob. I'll get it in a minute. Esau is the oldest one. Now, to have a son, the oldest son in many, many families has special significance. But in a Jewish family, or in the family of Isaac and, of course, his father Abraham, the oldest son was extremely significant because the oldest son would receive the blessing of his father. The oldest son would, of course, be the son through whom the Messiah was coming. And he was special. And, of course, today in the monarchies of Europe, the oldest son, he's going to be the next king, right? Supposedly. So, in this family, they had some issues. I guess all families have issues, don't they? Of some kind or other. Rebekah had a special place in her heart for her younger son, Jacob. The scripture says she loved him. It does not say that about Esau. But Isaac had a special love for Esau because Esau was his firstborn son. That kind of parental preference is always going to create problems. You can't count the number of people that I've come in contact with in preaching 53 years that say, well, Mama didn't like me as much as so-and-so. Or Daddy didn't like his girls, but he liked his boys. Or Daddy liked his girls better than he did his son. And the list goes on and on and on. When I was teaching in high school in Nashville, a good number of years ago, I was the head of a department, and you can look at me right now and see that I'm not very tall. And in my same department was another man. His name was Clinton Morgan. Clinton and Vinton Morgan. And the students would say, "You're brothers, aren't you?" And we would laugh with it. Yeah, we're brothers. And one day, one boy spoke up and said, "Mr. Morgan, why is Clinton so much taller than you?" I said, "Well, it's easy. Mama fed him more than she did me." And they took it literally. And as long as he was in my department, they always whispered to each other, "You know, Vinton Morgan's mother didn't like him much." But you know, in reality, that's true. That happens. Okay? Then a very special day came that we read about in detail here in the Old Testament. Isaac had grown old, and in his old age, his eyesight began to fail to the point where he literally could not see. Now, Rebekah being younger, her health much better perhaps, Isaac said, "It's time for me to die. I need to pass on the blessing to my elder son." You remember the story very well. Rebekah overheard it, and she wanted the blessing to go to her favorite son. What kind of woman was Rebekah? Nathan, give me a word.
Well, I think she had the gift of God's prophecy, because Esau was a snake. She knew it.
Taken up for.
Isaac didn't see that Esau was a snake.
Well, Nathan, all that may be true, but she was deceiving. And you know, she overheard it. And of course, what Esau was supposed to do was to fix some venison pottage or porridge or crockpot stuff. You know, stew. But he couldn't go to Kroger and buy the venison. He had to go out and hunt for the animal. Then he had to slaughter it, prepare the meat, cook the meal, and then bring it to Daddy. But Rebekah had a plan. She called Jacob and said, "Now you go out and kill a lamb out here. It's easy to do. He's just right out the door there. You bring it in and I'll cook it. And then you go to your daddy." And Jacob replied very simply, "Mama, that's not going to work because Daddy knows that my brother's a hairy man and I'm not." She said, "I'll take care of that." And I've read it 1,000 times. And I don't know how this worked. But she put something on his arms or hands and around his neck that was hairy and said, "You wear that, put your garments around you, and you go in there, and Daddy will not know the difference." Amen. What about a wife like this? If she'll deceive you on one thing, she may deceive you on something else. And so all of this transpired, and of course Jacob goes in. And by the way, Jacob becomes a willing participant. There is absolutely no excuse for Jacob to do this because it's deception. And he went in, and Isaac was perplexed for a moment. You know, you sound like Jacob. Who are you? And he, what? He tells a lie. I'm Esau. He said, come here, let me feel you. He felt the hair. Well, that's Esau, but it sounds like Jacob. But he went through the meal, or whatever you want to call that, and then he passed the blessing on to him. And seemingly, in reading the scripture, it was almost a few minutes after Jacob left his daddy's presence that here comes in Esau. And of course, you remember the details. There's a lot of weeping, and Esau's angry. He's stolen my birthright. He's stolen the blessing. My brother is terrible. And of course, that passes away in a few days, and finally Rebekah hears something. She hears her eldest son saying to individuals unnamed, when daddy's dead, I'm going to kill my brother. And so Rebekah devises another plan. She's going to send her son, Jacob, back to the land where we today call it Iran and Iraq, to her brother, so her oldest son won't kill him. Now, what I want us to see tonight is this. Jacob deceived his daddy. Okay? He sinned. Is he going to pay for this sin? When he goes east, to make a very long story short, he meets a very beautiful girl. And he's in love with her. And he goes to her father and says, I want to marry this girl. What was her name, by the way? Rachel. And Daddy says, that's great. That's fine. Now, you ought to teach this story to teenage boys. I'm serious. You ought to teach this to teenage boys, because they say, I ain't going to make no mistake like Jacob made. What they don't understand was that the customs and traditions of that day are different than they are today. They had a wedding feast and all of that, and then, of course, the bride and groom go off at the end of the day, and the next morning, Jacob finds out what? He married the wrong one. His father-in-law deceived him. Be not deceived. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. He deceived and was deceived. Now, that's the first principle. The second principle of this law is you reap more than what? More than you sow. Let's skip a whole lot of years in there, and let's go up to the fact that Jacob's an old man. He's got how many sons? 12. How many daughters? 1. By the way, what's her name? Dinah. And Jacob made a mistake that his mama made. What was that mistake?
Loved Joseph better than all of them.
Does history repeat itself? All through the scriptures, history repeats itself. And he loved Joseph more than all of the other boys. Did they know it? How did they feel about it? They hated him. And when, of course, Joseph went out to the fields to see how his brothers were caring for the sheep, that's always interesting, folks. Everybody's out there caring for the sheep except Joseph. Daddy's going to keep him close to home. And he'd go out there, and as you read the scriptures, you remember it. They saw him coming and said, let's kill him. We hate him. The same thing that their uncle wanted to do to their daddy. Let's kill him. But Reuben speaks up, and this is the only time in the entire Bible that Reuben's got any backbone. By the way, Jacob had a description for Reuben. You remember that description? He's as stable as what? Water. But this time, Reuben stands up and says, no, let's sell him. We'll make a little bit of money. Oh, that sounds even better. Let's sell him. That way, number one, we'll get rid of him. Number two, we'll make a little money at the same time. Let's sell him. And they did, of course, as you well remember. And he was sold down into Egypt. Now, what are we going to tell Daddy? Well, you remember they took his coat of many colors. They killed a lamb and put the blood all over it. Went back to Daddy and said, Daddy, we don't know whose coat this is. Do you recognize it? Lie. And Daddy immediately recognized it. It's his boy's coat. Well, we don't know what happened to him. Lie number two. We don't know what happened to him. And Jacob almost dies from grief. Almost dies from grief. The second principle of the mentioned principle in Galatians 6:10 is that you always reap more than you sow. How many times has he been deceived? 2 times. How many times did he deceive? Once. Jacob is reaping a harvest. And then, of course, Jacob lives. And he then has to deal with his sons going down into Egypt to buy grain. And finally, that mean man down in Egypt, remember him? He's kept one of the brothers down there. And this time, the remaining brothers have to go back and tell Daddy. Who did he keep, by the way? Who? Benjamin? No. Simeon, right. Keep Simeon. And they had to go back and tell Daddy. And he said, I've lost my boy, and now I've lost a second one. And they can't get any more grain unless they bring Benjamin down, right? Benjamin is, now this is what you got to remember. Benjamin is a replacement for who? Joseph. They have the same mama. Daddy, we can't get any more grain unless Benjamin comes down, because that mean man down there said, we told him we had a younger brother, and he said, you can't get any more grain till you bring him down there. Now, I want you to think a minute. What's going on in the heart of Jacob? He's lost his favorite wife. We haven't even mentioned that. She's gone. She's dead. He's buried her. He's lost his favorite son. He's dead. And now they want to take his next favorite son, Benjamin, and the chances of him coming back aren't very good. Now, I want you to really appreciate tonight the pain, mental speaking, that Jacob had. It's bad enough, folks, to lose a child. Nobody likes that idea. No parent likes that idea. That hurts. You want to lose a second one? Simeon's gone, folks. Is Jacob paying a price for his wrongs? Not once, not twice, 3 times. Jacob paid a price. And so that story illustrates for us exactly what Paul's saying. We're going to reap what we sow. Now, I want to back up before we quit with this. You know, when Rebekah sent Jacob off to a far land to save him from his brother, when Jacob came back home, Mama was gone. You ever read that in your scriptures? When Rebekah sent her son off to save him, she paid a price too. She never saw him again. And the one that was supposed to die, Daddy, he was still alive. Jacob paid a price. Rebekah paid a price. And what we need to know as Christians, there's another verse I do want to read it to you. It's over here in Hosea chapter 8. The King James Version reads like this, and I'm going to read it instead of one of the more modern translations. For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. By that simple idea, the whirlwind is what we would basically describe as a tornado or something. In the Southwest, it's a dust devil. And a tornado has little respect, folks. I don't know, Walter remembers what year the one went through here. 90? Yeah. They were having church services and it just came right that way. And it had no respect for anybody along the Belleville-Johnsville Road. House, barn, tree, anything. You sow to the wind, that is, you sow, as some people say, wild oats, you're going to reap a big harvest that is disrespectful of your feelings, your emotions, and your life. You got to remember, when you're a teenager, oh, I know this ain't right, but I can get away with it. It's interesting to have a son as old as I have. I think he's going to be 44 this week. And he says, Daddy, you don't know I did this when I was a teenager. You know what he doesn't know? I knew all about it. I had spies everywhere. I did. A preacher has spies everywhere because everybody in the church knows if my son does something wrong, I hear about it. Okay? If he does something good, I don't ever hear about that. But you know something, folks? I've heard these young men that age and maybe younger said, well, this is what I used to do, but Mama didn't know it. And man, it got me in trouble later. Right? You reap what you sow. And that's why you have to drill into the heads of children. You don't do this because you're going to pay a terrible price later on. You reap what you sow. And if there's a witness to the truth of that in the Old Testament, it is Jacob. Anybody comment or question as we close our short class tonight? Well, thank you very much for your attention. We always close our class, and certainly we want to make sure that the invitation is always offered, and it's not just offered at certain times, but we offer it again tonight. And I'll ask you to stand and sing. We'll sing number 679, and it is I Have Decided, right?
No, I know the Lord will find a way.
Okay, same idea. Okay. Will you please stand as Joe leads us?